Hello and welcome to Business, Wealth and Mental Health, the show that explores how a thriving business, wise financial management, and peaceful relationships are better for your mental health. And on today's show, I have the wonderful, the awesome Logan Smith, and he's here to talk about energy. We're going to have a bit of a discussion because energy, it is a hot topic at the moment. It's certainly, there's a lot of information out there. There's some misinformation out there. And in the nuclear space, which has now entered the forum as for discussion, especially with the coming elections, it's a topic that we really need to understand and have a better grasp on. And Logan is a specialist in that area of nuclear. Logan, do you want to tell us a little bit about yourself and how you connect to those little particles that run around and apparently give fish three eyes?
Thank you very much for having me on your program, Damien. It's a pleasure to be back on Gippsland FM. And yes, we are running an information session in Latrobe Valley in Morwell in the middle of this month. But yeah, it's going to be an information session about nuclear. And yes, the little neutrons that buzz around inside uranium 235 and 238, and they buzz around and they cause chain reactions and they cause heat and they raise steam and they drive a turbine, much the same way as Latrobe Valley has been generating electricity through coal for the last, how long is it? 60 years or so?
One of the topics that's come up is water, and that nuclear uses massive, massive amounts of water. Now, I'm not going to talk about lithium and how much water that uses in its production, but from when you're talking about Latrobe Valley itself, Blue Rock Lake Blue Rock Lake was originally constructed with more coal-fired power stations in mind being built here. Now, those power stations never got built. What is the reality as far as water usage and nuclear power plants?
Well, first and foremost, a nuclear power station, like a coal-fired power station, is a thermal power station. It is a hot rock that heats water, raises steam, and drives a turbine. Obviously, as part of the ranking cycle, you need to cool that water back down, but it's largely like for like in terms of a swapping one out for the other. I understand there'll be a couple of trivial differences, and my associate Robert Parker can probably get into the nitty gritty details on that on the night. But yeah, the asset or the existing resources you have in the valley are there. It's just swapping out the way that you raise steam. One of the key things that's keen to remember about thermal power stations is it uses water. It doesn't consume water, or at least the vast majority of it doesn't consume water. It basically uses it as a heat sink, a body of water to absorb heat or to condense, the heat and remove that from the cycle once it's no longer needed. So yes, you will lose a little bit of water in evaporation. You currently do in the cooling towers that you've got up at Loy Yang and your lawn, but a lot of that water is just returned to the resource to be used again.
When you look at the cooling towers, there's these big chimneys that have constantly having steam come out the top of them. But in reality, that what you're saying is that's a minor portion of what's actually used. Is that right? It's not. This is not a massive amount of water going up the chimney, so to speak.
Well, it's probably a large amount, comparatively speaking to what you have in your house. But no, I mean, like if you drive past those same, what's the name of them? I think it's a hyperbaric paraboloid is the name of the shape there. But yeah, they're open at the bottom. You can drive past them on the local road, and you'll just see water, just liquid, rushing down like a waterfall at the base of those cooling towers. That's not getting evaporated. That's going back into the system.
From what I understand with nuclear, there's two different components of the water. So you've got two systems. One is an enclosed system that actually has contact with the uranium and does get irradiated. And then there's other water that doesn't, which is what we're talking about, that cooling water. Is that correct, or am I misunderstanding there?
For Eh, There's two different designs that are key in looking at here. One is the pressurized water reactor, which is the bulk of what you'll find in the West, particularly the United States. And they typically do have a primary coolant loop, the one that is cooling, that comes in direct contact with the core. And that's essentially isolated. That's basically, it doesn't top off. It's the same water that goes through day in, day out. And then you'll have the secondary coolant loop, which is basically what raises the steam that enters the turbine hall. So those ones are separate. There are other designs, such as the boiling water reactor, which is a little bit cheeky, a little bit cleverer. It just uses a single coolant loop. So the water that raises the steam does come in contact with the fuel, and there is radiological portions within that, but it's fairly short-lived, and you can keep that separated from the environment.
As far as water consumption goes, because there was a lot of concern about nuclear power is going to use all this water and it's going to deplete the water that we have available. But from what you're saying, the plan for what for Loy Yang, for the nuclear power plant if get elected, would be going to Loy Yang, that wouldn't use any more water than is currently being used in the region.
They'd be pretty close to equivalent, I would imagine. As I said, there could be slight differences or fairly trivial differences, but ultimately, it is a thermal power station. You've just swapped out the method of heating it. In terms of what really uses water in Australia, I'd be more concerned about agriculture. Agriculture uses vastly quantities, as an industry, uses water in quantities vastly greater than what we do in power generation. Now, no one's saying that we shouldn't continue growing the best food on the planet.
Okay, so that answers the water question. Another one that has come quite prevalent, although it doesn't seem to be so much here in Latrobe Valley, a lot of people don't seem to be concerned about it, seems to be concerns from people that don't live here, is to do with when we think about Japan, when they had the earthquake. And in this region, is an earthquake a real risk factor for a nuclear power plant in Latrobe Valley?
Short answer, no. Longer answer is a bit more nuanced, because seismology, science, and engineering is a deep topic in and of itself. I was actually listening to a bit of a presentation by Mr. Whitaker, who's a seismologist engineer who works in the United States, Australian, expat Australian, in the United States on part of the board for making recommendations on on seismology of nuclear power stations. Now he sort of, we've floated this question with him. It's The short answer is that yes, when you site a nuclear power station or any piece of capital infrastructure, it is prudent to do your seismology calculations and design, make sure you incorporate that into design. Having said that, the level of seismic activity we have in Australia is significantly less than what you will find in other nations around the world, particularly those on the Ring of Fire. Japan is one, obviously, with Fukushima, and other nations. Now, granted, the Latrobe Valley, is from what we understand, is a more seismically active area of Australia, but you have to put that in context with other areas that are far more seismically available or seismically active in the broader world. The other thing to remember about about earthquakes, and when someone mentions a value on the Richter scale, that is not a linear relationship. 4.5, which I believe is what occurred in the Hunter Valley fairly recently, is not half of 9.0, which was the size of the earthquake in Japan in 2011. You do the calculations of the actual intensity of that, the difference between 4.5 and 9 is about 20 million. It's a massive difference in the strength of those reactors. So the key thing to remember there is, yes, there was a earthquake and tsunami in Japan that struck those reactors at Fukushima. But it's important to remember all those reactors shut down when the earthquake struck, as they were designed to do. The earthquake didn't actually cause any damage to them. And if you can have reactors in an area like that, withstanding earthquake of magnitude 9 on the Richter scale, you can absolutely design reactors to resist any sort of reasonably planned earthquake or reasonably expected earthquake you'll get in the Latrobe Valley.
And let's put that into context of numbers. As you said, there was a 4.5 in the Hunter Valley recently. What sort of earthquake is, 9 happened in Japan, and there were some issues, but as you say, there are safety redundancies, and I'd like to talk about them a little bit more. But for Latrobe Valley, let's put that into context, because you mentioned that this area here is a little bit more seismically active. And I know for people that live here, they will know that we do get the occasional earthquake every now and it shakes a few things, but there's no real damage. Certainly buildings don't fall down or anything like that. It's just a little bit of a shake and go, oh, what was that? And
Yeah,
that's it. And it doesn't happen very often.
the
What
buildings and your
sort of
infrastructure are
scale would
designed
have
to.
to happen of a seismic event to actually cause damage to a nuclear power plant where it's going to put the population at risk?
Um, I, I don't know. I don't know how large a earthquake you would need to break for the earthquake to break a reactor. I just don't know what size that is.
Yeah.
That's too deep for me, I'm afraid.
Okay, no problem. That's all right. Because I mean, and well, what you were saying was 9 was a. Let's talk about the safety factors then. So, what was the earthquake in Japan? What level was that,
It
and
was
what sort of
9 on
damage
the
did
Richter
that do?
scale. Yeah, no, it was 9 on the Richter scale, and it was the greatest earthquake in recorded history experienced by Japan. It was the fourth greatest earthquake globally on record. So that's a bit of an
Massive by
indication. Yeah,
any.
it was a big earthquake. Now, obviously, that created a tsunami, and that's where the majority of the problems came from. It did inundate the backup systems at Fukushima and cause a triple reactor meltdown. The thing that's disappointing from, I suppose, a nuclear advocacy point, or a nuclear advocate's perspective, is that natural disaster claimed around about, I think it was just shy of 20,000 lives. But the fallout or the radiological contamination, which did occur in Fukushima, claimed zero and is expected or is not expected to claim any lives ever. So I think it's important to realize that, yeah, that was a disaster, but that was a natural disaster. That was not a nuclear disaster. Yes, okay, there was a nuclear disaster, there was the meltdown, but in the context of the actual damage done, the damage was done by the natural disaster.
And from what you're saying there, the damage was not done by the earthquake itself; it was done by the water, the tsunami. Is that right?
Uh, that's a big ask. It was a very large earthquake, and yes, you do design your infrastructure in that region. It would have been designed to certain earthquake specifications. I don't want to comment on what proportion of the damage in the prefecture was caused by the earthquake and what was caused by the tsunami. I think it's plausible to say that, yeah, there was probably some infrastructure damage as a result of the earthquake.
Yeah, okay. So there was infrastructure damage as a result of the earthquake. It was the fourth largest in history from what we understand. What you
Fourth largest in recorded history,
Yeah,
my research has told me. Yeah.
yeah. And so from that perspective, when designing a nuclear uh, power plant here for Latrobe Valley, and I know you're an engineer, and I've worked with a lot of engineers, and when they're designing things like bridges and things like that, there's always an element of over engineering that goes into it.
Yeah, it's a
What
safety
kind of
factor.
redundancies would be built into a nuclear reactor that was built here to go, okay, we've got an average of, say, I don't know the figures, but say 4 on the Richter scale of potential here, and maybe a 5 might be allowing for that logarithmic scale. Or
Mm.
what is the we go, okay, that's a likelihood that we've got 1 in 100-year events, those kind of things that we allow for when engineers are doing these calculations. What sort of safety factors would be put in place to ensure the safety of people from any kind of fallout?
Well, first and foremost, if you have a nuclear reactor facility, it'll have um, there'll be a method of sensing ground shaking, and if it gets over a certain threshold, it'll probably engage your automatic scram. Your scram is a basically, you hit the button, or in this case, it's probably an automated system, but you've got the reactor, it's burbling along, heating up water. It drops the control rods in there and basically shuts down the nuclear reaction. So what the control rods are, they go down into the core, they absorb all the neutrons that are buzzing around to prevent them from interacting with other atoms and splitting more uranium and continuing that chain reaction. And then all you've got left over is a decay heat. And generally, what you've got is you'll have as long as your power is not interrupted, you've got pumps that just keep cycling coolant water through the system and just keeps that reactor cool. If you do lose power, you're probably going to, or you're absolutely going to have redundant systems. This is all part of defense in depth, which is a big part of nuclear reactor safety design. And you'll have something like diesel-powered generators that will kick in to keep that water, keeping the system cool until such time as it's ready to start it up again.
So if I'm hearing correctly, what you're saying is that the nuclear reactors are designed that when an issue happens, it automatically it has an automatic trigger which then drops the nuclear uranium.
Yeah, you'll have control rods. It'll trip the reactor.
Control rods, that's the word I was looking
control
for.
rods. It'll trip the reactor, drop the control rods in until such time as human intervention can come in and say, "Yep, okay, the situation is contained. Start her up again."
So, and when you describe it like that, that's very different from how nuclear and problems are described. But really, it sounds very simple. It's in an area where it's active. As soon as there's a problem, it just drops down and it stops that, and then you have redundancies to make sure that the coolant keeps flowing so that it cools down, and then there's no more risk. Is that?
Yeah, this is the design of nuclear power stations, and all sorts of large capital infrastructure projects will have safety methods and procedures in place and engineering procedures in place to keep that asset safe. You will have similar things in your existing coal-fired power stations.
Yeah. And so when we look at nuclear disasters, there's really three main ones that come to mind. And I think I've forgotten the names. Long Island, was that?
3 Mile Island.
3 Mile Island. I was going to say 9 Mile, but
there
was 3 Mile Island, and that
TMI,
was
3 Mile Island. Yep.
Yep. There was obviously the one in Ukraine, Chernobyl.
Chernobyl. Yep.
And then Japan. The three main ones that come to mind.
One. Yeah.
Yeah. And when you put it in context, I mean, 3 Mile Island was a long time ago, and the technology and safety redundancies and all that kind of stuff is very, very different now than it was back then. I could imagine that the Chernobyl one, from what I understand and read on it, it really was a lot to do with safety protocols not being followed, which you follow a number of things that are happening in Russia and Ukraine.
Yeah, look, it probably had more to do with the style of governance that you had in the in Russia at the time, or the Soviet Union at the time, and sort of the need to know basis of everything. Information was not shared, and possibly information needed for the people that were running that plant to do that, that ill-fated safety test, they were not informed of all the information they needed to do that.
Yeah. And then you have Japan, which was, you see, the fourth largest earthquake in recorded history.
Yeah.
And out of all the nuclear reactors, and I haven't done a count of how many there are, but there's a lot in the world.
It's over 400 power reactors at the moment, from what I understand.
Yeah, so there's a significant amount, and there's been 3 incidents, and 2 of those you could probably put down to, well, one of them is a freak earthquake, which we're not likely to have that component here. I don't see water rushing into Latrobe Valley
unlikely.
from a tsunami.
Yeah, unlikely. Look, yeah, it's not to say that the Japanese authorities were completely blameless. There were problems there. There were lots of lessons learned, but we also need to put things in perspective. Yes, there was a triple reactor meltdown, and that disaster killed and is expected to kill 0 people.
Yeah.
It's it's tragic that it happened, but in the broader context of what happened that day, it was nowhere near the worst thing that happened that day.
Yeah, so there was no deaths as a result of that.
No.
Let's move on to another topic. It's a hot discussion in nuclear, is cost. When we're comparing that to other energy sources, from what my calculation is, nuclear actually falls into the category of, it is long-term, it's significantly cheaper than wind and solar. Do you have any information on that you're able to share? Or
it's a very hairy question, because when people go out and they say, "Oh, nuclear is twice as costly or 6 times as costly as any other source in Australia or a renewable source in Australia, it's usually coming about from the gen cost from CSIRO, and that's an
Well,
LCO. It's an sorry.
sorry, I'm just laughing at GenCost because, I mean, from what I understand with the GenCost report, the agent CSIRO said we're not experts, so they went to other consultants, and the consultants went to the internet.
Yeah. Look, it has since 2019. It's been a subject of a bit of controversy. There was the nuclear inquiry, the federal inquiry into nuclear power in 2019, and they came under a bit of scrutiny there. And more recently, the latest Gen Cost, I read through it. I thought it was quite entertaining because it said they received an unprecedented level of public feedback for this particular result or this particular year. 45 submissions, an unprecedented 45 submissions came in suggesting why aren't they, considering nuclear, and here's my back of the calculation. And so they thought, okay, fine, we'll do large scale nuclear. They've done SMRs previously, but we'll do conventional large scale nuclear. And they came up with their latest numbers. Now the problem is that LCOE is it's the levelized cost of electricity. It is really like an investment. It's a metric to compare different generation sources on a level playing field. So it's really just all the costs in building, all the costs in operation, divided by the amount of energy output you're going to get out of it over its lifetime. It doesn't take into account values. It doesn't take into account the full system costs. So you and I, when we get our electricity bill every month, we look through it and it's split up into a number of things, and a lot of those might be generation costs, retail, but also things like transmission or storage or firming or any number of other aspects to it. Now, none of those ones are captured in an LCOE calculation.
Yeah.
So when someone comes up and says, well, it's more expensive than this particular renewable option, if it's based on the LCOE, it really misses out on a lot of detail that is important to consider.
Well, and the LCOE, from what I've seen, also to include subsidies and other penalties as well in the cost, which is not really.
Yeah, well, that's not going to be captured in the LCOE either. So, I don't think.
Well, from what I've seen at EARS, the subsidies are included as a discount that wind and solar get, and certainly when they include coal, they include the taxes as well from ones that I've seen. Anyway, we need to move on from that. Let's talk about the conference because we are running out of time.
Sure.
You've got it's coming up on the 18th, is that right? The 18th of
18th of September. 18th of September at the Morwell RSL from 6 o'clock to 8 o'clock. Yep. We'll have our three speakers. We'll have Graham Middlemas, who is a councillor in your region. He wants to talk about nuclear power and market reform and what it can offer the region. We're also going to have Robert Parker from Nuclear for Climate. He's been, Robert Parker's quite an accomplished individual. He's a civil engineer. He's been the past president of the Australian Nuclear Association. He's done a lot of study and a lot of work in nuclear on his blog, and traveling to other countries to see how they get about it. So he wants to give a presentation on the economics and sort of how that can all work. And also going to have Dr. Robert Barr, who's an expert in transmission, which is also going to be a key part of the talk. Former national president of the Electrical Energy Society of Australia. He's our Dr. Robert Barr, and it'll be emceed by Dr. Andrea Leong, who's the current president of We Planet Australia, and it'll be a good night. We'll be very keen to have people there and be very keen to answer all your questions.
So, and how do people find out more about the event, and how do they book tickets?
The event is now published on the We Planet Australia website. So that is at www.weplanetaustralia.org. There is an ad on the front page of the We Planet website. There's also an ad in the events page as well. If you click on either of them, there is a link to the try booking page, which you can book your ticket for on that page and secure your seat.
Fantastic. Logan, it's been such a pleasure having you on the show, talking about nuclear energy and giving some clarity about some of the things that probably have got a little bit of misinformation out there, but I really appreciate you taking the time to share that. And listeners, get down to the conference on the 18th of September and learn a little bit more about the energy and how nuclear energy can impact your lives and make our lives better. Thank you,
Thank you.
Logan.
Thank you very much, Damien. It's been an absolute pleasure being on your program.